I'm on the 83rd floor. What? I'm on the 83rd floor.
What's the telephone number? C. You can barely see where 4 2623.
Are they going to be able to get somebody up here?
Of course, man. We're coming up to you.
Two of us in this office. We're not ready to die, but it's getting bad.
There's no one here yet, and the floor is completely engulfed. We're on the floor, and we can't breathe.
Please, hurry.
No fire for now, and no smoke, right?
Of course there's smoke.
Where are you? Which way you guys get to? We're getting there. Doesn't feel like it, man. I got young kids.
It's very hot. I don't see any air anymore.
Okay.
All I see is smoke.
Smoke rises. We're on the floor. We're in the window. Can't see.
Can you stay on the line with me, please?
Yes, ma'am. I'm
going to die, aren't I?
No.
I'm going to die.
Ma'am, say your prayers.
Thank God the glory in from the left.
Help!
Ma'am?
Help!
What the hell happened?
Oh, my God.
Oh, God!
For most Americans, the destruction of the Twin Towers will remain embedded in their memories and their hearts as the epitome of horror, astonishment, and unjustified human suffering. But for some, it may have represented the moment where large corporate interests of global reach and cynical economic greed found the perfect place for a secret encounter. Common wisdom has it that the September 11 attacks destroyed two of the best jewels America has ever had. But exactly jewels, the Twin Towers, were not. While they sat on some of the most valuable real estate in the world, after 30 years the Twin Towers had become obsolete. With each of the floors built as an open space of almost 1 acre in size, the rising cost of energy had made it extremely expensive to keep the buildings warm in winter and cool in summer. General maintenance was also very expensive compared to buildings from more recent years. In his 1999 book on the Twin Towers, Divided We Stand, author Eric Darton wrote, "When the World Trade Center was bombed in February 1993, it was already passing its prime as office space, overtaken by a generation of more recent, cybernetically smart buildings with higher ceilings and greater built-in electrical capacity. To maintain the Trade Center as Class A office space commanding top rents, the Port Authority would have had to spend $800 million rebuilding its electrical, electronic communications, and cooling systems. Furthermore, after the 1993 bombing, the tenancy had dropped dramatically, and it had been very hard to bring it back to normal levels. But the biggest problem with the Twin Towers was the large amount of asbestos they contained. Built in a time when the use of asbestos was still allowed in civil construction, at least 400 tons of this extremely dangerous material had been used to fireproof the steel structure of the buildings and to insulate hundreds of miles of pipings for water, heating, and air conditioning. Asbestos was also present in the ceiling panels, the elevator shafts, and the vinyl tiles from office floors. From a property condition assessment of the Twin Towers dated December 2000, we read, "According to Port Authority records, a total of 7 million square feet of vinyl asbestos floor tiles were installed in the World Trade Center. By the time asbestos was banned from civil construction, the Twin Towers were nearing their completion. Initially, the asbestos was encapsulated, wherever possible, to prevent the particles from being inhaled. But in the 1990s, the regulations grew tighter, and every time a simple renovation was needed, the complete removal and replacement of the asbestos was also required. At the same time, because of the health risk it posed, the cost of asbestos removal and abatement had been skyrocketing. Safety procedures required the areas to be treated to be vacated in advance, hermetically sealed, and kept under negative pressure at all times to prevent particles from escaping outside. Only specialized workers could access the area, wearing airtight suits and respirators. A full decontamination process was required every time they left the area. In the mid-90s, the Port Authority put out different bids for the removal and replacement of the asbestos in a case-by-case scenario. For example, this is a 1995 contract for the installation of 2 low-voltage substations in Towers 1 and 2. One section in the contract listed the replacement of asbestos at floors 41, 42, 75, and 76 in Tower 1 and floors 75 and 76 in Tower 2. Total cost for the asbestos removal and replacement, $868,000. Tower 2, 40th floor. Contract for asbestos removal and abatement. Total cost, $650,000. Towers 1 and 2, removal of asbestos and new ceilings at floors 7, 41, and 75. Total cost, $882,000. It soon became clear that the Twin Towers were quickly turning from a prestigious asset into a serious liability. From the December 2000 condition assessment, we read, from 1986 to 1999, a total 31 contracts were bid, and a total of $58.2 million was spent in abatement projects. By then, 3.5 million square feet of vinyl asbestos floor tile was removed. Only half of the initial 7 million square feet installed. At the estimated cost of $5 to $6 per square foot, that accounted for an additional $20 million in cost for the Port Authority, and that was for the floor tiles only. There were also hundreds of thousands of square feet of spray-on fireproofing to be removed throughout both buildings. And then there were the elevators. This is the list of elevator shafts with asbestos-containing material as of December 2000. This is Tower 1. And this is Tower 2. Reportedly, by the year 2000, the Port Authority was looking at an asbestos abatement bill of as much as $1 billion, the same money it would have cost to build a brand new tower. Back in the 90s, the Port Authority had sued the insurance companies, trying to get them to cover the cost of the asbestos removal. But in May 2001, 4 months before the terrorist attack, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey lost their 10-year-old court battle. At that point, the Port Authority was between a rock and a hard place. The Twin Towers could no longer be maintained without incurring the cost of asbestos removal, yet they could not be demolished because of the large amounts of asbestos they contained. The only remaining option was to dismantle and remove the two poison-filled giants one piece at a time. But the cost of such an operation would have been so astronomical that no one has ever tried to put a number on it. Luckily for all, the stalemate was broken when a real estate tycoon named Larry Silverstein, who already owned Building 7, offered to purchase a 99-year lease for the Twin Towers.
76 years old, and look at him go. He walks fast, talks fast, and is always selling.
Silverstein seemed in a big hurry to close the deal. Even though he had been hospitalized for a car accident during the bidding operations, he asked his doctors to take him off the morphine so the deal could be finalized.
So I told the doctor, I said, kill the morphine, and I got to get my people in here, because you can't think with morphine. So they let the morphine run down. The pain was terrible, but I brought everybody together, and that's when we framed our best and final bid.
On July 24, 2001, Larry Silverstein celebrated the acquisition of the Twin Towers with a public ceremony.
Silverstein signed the lease on the World Trade Center just 6 weeks before 9/11.
He then took out an insurance policy covering the Twin Towers for $3.2 billion in case of total destruction. Silverstein then began spending every morning of the week in his new office in the North Tower.
And so my mornings were spent at the Trade Center, and then by noon I was back uptown.
But on September 11, luckily for him, Silverstein didn't go to work. Even though he had already scheduled a business meeting in the North Tower, he found out that his wife had made an appointment for him at the dermatologist.
The morning of September 11th, Silverstein was scheduled to have breakfast at the restaurant at the top of the North Tower. He canceled at the last minute at the insistence of his wife, Clara, who wanted him to go see his dermatologist.
That particular morning, my wife, God bless her, had made an appointment for me at the doctor. So I said, okay, yes, dear, I'll go.
Everyone who was in that restaurant that morning perished.
And then, just minutes later, received a telephone call to turn on a television set and witnessed this horrendous circumstance.
This is how, on the evening of September 11, Larry Silverstein found himself in control of some 12 million square feet of new office space to be built on some of the most valuable real estate in the world. And since the terrorist attacks had been two separate events, contended Silverstein, the insurance companies would have to pay him $7 billion to rebuild what he has always been calling My Three Towers.
I will spend $7 billion on my three towers.
Eventually, a settlement was reached for $4.5 billion, which was still one-third more than the amount initially insured by Silverstein. And since on September 11, due to the terrorist attacks, Building 7 had also been destroyed, Silverstein received another $800 million to rebuild a skyscraper that had originally cost $400 million.
It's a much more beautiful building. It's a glass facade, allows the light to come into the space. The views on four sides are phenomenal, and the space looks magnificent.
In the meantime, all the asbestos from the Twin Towers has been inhaled by the citizens of downtown Manhattan, and especially by the first responders and volunteers who worked at Ground Zero, who are now being decimated by mesothelioma and other pulmonary diseases. In the debate over the destruction of the World Trade Center, two important organizations have played a major role. One is NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was officially tasked by the U.S. government to investigate the collapse of the three skyscrapers. In 2005, NIST presented their final report on the collapse of the Twin Towers, and in 2008, the one on Building 7. For the Twin Towers, NIST concluded that they were brought down by the consequences of the impacts and the ensuing fires, while Building 7, according to NIST, was brought down primarily by fire alone. In other words, they fully confirmed the official version by the U.S. government. The other organization to bear weight on the debate has been Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, an association of professionals in civil construction founded in 2006 by San Francisco architect Richard Gage. Architects and Engineers lists over 2,000 experts in structural engineering, science of materials, architectural design, fire protection, science of construction, metallurgy, and even experts in controlled demolitions. Since they've entered the fray, Architects and Engineers has brought to the table a solid amount of scientific information refuting the official explanation by NIST on the collapses and confirming the theory of controlled demolitions instead. At the same time, Architects and Engineers has acted as an unrelenting watchdog for every action taken by NIST, pointing out every single error in their work, and even forcing them, in some cases, to make corrections to their reports.
I think it's something that we need to clarify and correct in the final version of the report.
Okay.
The first issue that needs to be clarified is the actual strength and solidity of the Twin Towers, since both the 9/11 Commission and the debunkers have made extensive efforts to depict them as extremely light and fragile buildings.
The outside of each tower was covered by a frame of 14-inch wide steel columns. The centers of the steel columns were 40 inches apart. These exterior walls bore the majority of the weight of the building. The interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped.
Le torri di New York invece erano sostenute da un'intelaiatura esterna, da sottili nervature d'acciaio, insomma erano come dei parallelepipedi vuoti.
Il World Trade Center era una struttura leggerissima, era la massima espressione del grattacielo leggero, come lo chiamano i tecnici. C'è un solo altro edificio che io sappia, che è quella che si chiamava un tempo la Sears Tower a Chicago, che usa lo stesso tipo di struttura. Dopo il World Trade Center nessuno l'ha più usata.
As we shall see, all these statements are false. Contrary to traditional skyscrapers, where all the support columns are equally spaced, in the Twin Towers, part of the supporting columns had been moved towards the exterior wall, creating a large column-free space available for rental. For this reason, the external structure had literally become a grid of steel columns made with prefabricated blocks that were mounted on site. These are the thin steel nerves mentioned by debunker Alberto Angela, 244 steel columns placed approximately 2 feet apart, which supported 40% of the weight of the towers. Far from being two empty parallelepipeds, the internal structure was comprised of 47 steel columns, so long and sturdy that a special factory in Japan had to be built in order to assemble them. It was the core structure to support the majority of the weight of the building, 60% of it, and not the external structure. The core structure seen on the left is what the 9/11 Commission has called a hollow steel shaft. This is the same core structure near the base of the tower. The core structure was an actual, extremely robust steel skyscraper built within another skyscraper. The core structure housed the stairs, the elevators, and all other services needed for the functioning of the tower. The inner walls of the core structure were made of simple layers of sheetrock. A long series of steel trusses connected the core structure to the external one and supported the floors. The floors were also prefabricated rectangular pieces covered by a thin layer of concrete. The internal and external structure connected through an umbrella-like structure called a hat truss, which kept together the towers and bound them from above. The idea that this kind of structure is fragile and therefore no longer used after 9/11 is disproven by the new Building 7 built by Larry Silverstein. A strong central structure supports the majority of the weight of the building. Long steel beams support the floors and connect the core structure to the external one, allowing for large column-free space in between, a very similar concept to the one used in the Twin Towers. Most importantly, the debunkers forget to mention that the Twin Towers were built with a structural redundancy of 3 to 5 times the weight they were meant to support.
This structure was capable of holding 3 to 5 times the weight.
These buildings are built to handle several times the load above them. So those perimeter columns could handle 5 times the load above them, and the core columns could handle 3 times the load above them.
In addressing the solidity of the Twin Towers, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology stated that its 244 perimeter columns made it one of the most redundant and one of the most resilient skyscrapers. On the same subject, the architectural firm of Roth & Sons wrote, "The building as designed is 16 times stiffer than a conventional structure. The Virendeel trusses would be so effective, according to the engineer's calculations, that all the columns on one side of a tower could be cut, as well as the 2 corners and several columns on the adjacent sides, and the tower would still be strong enough to withstand a 100-mile-per-hour wind." John Skilling, the structural engineer who designed the Twin Towers, stated, "Live loads on these perimeter columns can be increased more than 2,000% before failure occurs." In particular, the Twin Towers were designed to sustain the impact of a large airliner traveling at 600 miles per hour and still remain standing. Interviewed in 1993 by the Seattle Times, John Skilling stated, "We looked at every possible thing we could think of that could happen to the buildings, even to the extent of an airplane hitting the side. Our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel from the airplane would dump into the building. There would be a horrendous fire. A lot of people would be killed. The building structure would still be there." And it was. After the impacts, both towers remained standing, showing no major effect on their stability. Furthermore, NIST has confirmed that the initial jet fuel fires themselves lasted at most a few minutes. This means that from that moment on, the only available source of fuel for the fires was common office furnishings. And, as we know, regular office fires are not hot enough to affect the stability of a steel structure.
No steel frame high-rise building has ever collapsed due to fire.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
These kinds of designs have performed extraordinarily well over history. In fact, until this occurrence, no building had fallen down because of fire.
Furthermore, NIST estimated the combustible fuel loading was somewhat lower than found in prior surveys of office spaces. The number of interior walls, and thus the minimal amount of combustible interior finish and limited bookshelf space account for much of the differences. There was no reason for the towers to collapse at that point. With a structure that had clearly withstood the impacts and with less than average office content to feed the fires, both buildings should have remained standing, allowing for the evacuation and rescue of everyone who had survived the initial impacts and the fires. Instead, both buildings suddenly collapsed from top to bottom, one 56 minutes after the impact, the other as much as 1 hour and 42 minutes after the impact of the plane. Why? The debate on the collapse of the Twin Towers centers around 2 major questions. One is what caused the initial collapse of the top section of the building onto the lower part of each tower. The second is what caused the complete destruction of the remaining healthy structure below, once the top section had collapsed on it. As far as what initiated the collapse, at first we were told that the heat of the fires had softened and melted the structure of the building.
In 2002, NOVA depicted a scenario envisioned by many experts at the time, that the truss connections failed in the extreme heat, causing the floors to fall onto one another, precipitating the collapse.
As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give. Then you had this sequential failure that took place where it all pancaked one after the other.
In fact, it became known as the pancake theory.
Donc ça a donné lieu à la théorie qu'on appelle la théorie du pancake. C'est-à-dire que comme cette partie-là est tombée sur un plancher, ce plancher a cédé, puis en cascade, c'est tous les planchers qui ont cédé et qui sont tombés les uns sur les autres. C'est ça qu'on appelle la théorie du pancake.
But the pancake theory had a major flaw. It forgot to explain why the core structure of the towers collapsed. Furthermore, experts pointed out that jet fuel produces barely half the heat needed to melt steel. It would not have been enough to disconnect the trusses from the external structure. At that point, the official explanation backtracked and settled for a more generic weakening of the steel due to the fires.
You don't need to melt the steel columns, you just need to start weakening them.
What we found is it doesn't take temperatures high enough to melt steel. It just has to heat up the steel so it expands and then softens and weakens the structure until it collapses.
In the new explanation, the initial failure was no longer blamed on the rupture of the steel trusses, but on their sagging due to the heat.
The trusses stayed connected to the columns, even as they sagged from the heat. They pulled on the columns, bowing them inward nearly 5 feet in some areas, until the columns reached the breaking point.
Sta scaldando l'aria e scalda l'acciaio del solaio soprastante, che a questo punto comincia a flettersi, perde la propria resistenza ai carichi, si flette, tira in dentro le colonne, e a un certo punto le colonne della facciata che sono portanti, portano circa il 40% del peso della struttura, si rompono.
Suddenly the columns snapped, and as a result the entire top of the building came down pretty much in free fall because the kinetic energy that was unleashed was just huge.
NIST also maintained that the impact of the airplanes widely dislodged the fireproofing from the trusses, hastening the process that eventually caused them to sag. It should be noted that NIST made the dislodgement of the fireproofing a necessary condition for the towers to collapse.
The buildings would not have collapsed under the effects of the airplane impact and the jet fuel ignited multi-floor fires. And the reason it collapsed is because the fireproofing was dislodged.
But the theory of the sagging trusses created even more problems than the one before. First of all, there is no proof whatsoever that the fireproofing from the steel had been widely dislodged by the impacts, as NIST has maintained. The steel structure of a skyscraper is elastic, not rigid, and it absorbs the impacts by slowly swaying back and forth, not by vibrating.
The building swayed slowly one way toward the Hudson River to the west.
And by the time it came back, I just jumped up and just had to get out of the elevator.
In fact, there are good reasons to believe that the fireproofing from the steel was not dislodged at all, as in the following example.
This is James Glanz for the New York Times. When the plane hit the North Tower between the 94th and the 98th floors, Steve McIntyre, an engineer for the American Bureau of Shipping, was reading his email on the 91st floor. The plane hit, and I think he described it as the biggest wham he'd ever heard, but there wasn't much shaking. His email was still there after the impact. He was still staring at a glowing screen. He had a little knick-knack, a piece of slate in the shape of a sailboat, hadn't fallen off his desk. Pictures of his wife and kids, just propped up on a bookcase, were still upright. Nothing had fallen over.
McIntyre was just below the point of impact. If his pictures didn't even fall, why should the spray-on fireproofing have been detached from the steel trusses? Secondly, there's no proof that the temperatures were high enough to seriously weaken the steel in any case, with or without fireproofing.
The majority of the jet fuel was burnt up instantly in the big fireball, and it was gone. The fires that were left were office furnishings and carpet and things like that. A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code.
In their computer simulation, NIST claims to have observed temperatures beyond 1800 degrees during the fires. But NIST has used their own computational model, and they've never published the data from their simulation. When architects and engineers asked to verify the computer model used by NIST, their request was denied. The truth is that NIST itself admitted in their own report to have no proof for temperatures high enough to seriously weaken steel. From the NIST report we read, of the more than 170 areas examined on 16 perimeter column panels, only 3 columns had evidence that the steel reached temperatures above 250 degrees centigrade, or 480 degrees Fahrenheit. Only 2 core column specimens had sufficient paint remaining to make such an analysis, and the temperatures did not reach 250 degrees centigrade. No conclusive evidence was found to indicate that pre-collapse fires were severe enough to have a significant effect on the microstructure that would have resulted in weakening of the steel structure. In other words, NIST openly admits to have no proof to support their own theory. In conclusion, the known facts are: steel melts at about 2800 degrees Fahrenheit. Softening can begin at about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. Except for 3 isolated spots, NIST admits to have found no proof of temperatures beyond 480 degrees Fahrenheit, which is less than half the temperatures needed to seriously weaken steel. On the other hand, there is multiple evidence that the temperatures needed to seriously weaken steel were not reached for a sustained time in the Twin Towers. The first one is that a group of 16 people managed to descend through the area devastated by the impact without obviously being burned alive. One of them is Brian Clark.
And when we came to the 78th floor, the last layer was standing, but it was cracked. And there were flames licking up the other side of the wall like this. It wasn't a roaring inferno. I sensed that the flames were maybe starved for oxygen right there, in the interior. We kept going, and we got onto the 74th floor. When we got down that far, normal conditions. The lights were on, fresh air coming up from below.
Attivissimo has maintained that these people managed to survive because in that part of the building, the stairwell runs on the side of the tower and not through the center.
Quando sono passati di lì, sono passati attraverso una zona che era nell'angolo opposto rispetto agli incendi. Quindi è logico che non siano stati bruciati. Questa scala fa questo giro e scende.
In truth, stairwell A traverses to the side of the tower on the 82nd floor, but Clark and his colleagues were on the 84th. This means they descended 2 floors in the center of the tower before crossing over. Furthermore, one of Clark's colleagues went back from the 81st to the 91st floor before descending all the way to the ground.
Ron DiFrancesco, who went in the 81st floor with me, he went up to 91, caught up to the people, laying down on the floor, thinking that there was fresher air at floor level. He made his way back to the stairs.
And so I started to run downstairs. And so I ended up on ground level and I went to walk out.
Had there been a temperature of 1100 degrees around the stairwell, nobody would have been able to go through it alive. Secondly, there is a series of thermographic images shot with an infrared camera showing temperatures much lower than those needed to soften steel. This is the North Tower, seen from below. It's 9:18, about a half an hour after the impact of the first plane, and the indicated temperatures do not reach the color yellow, which means they don't exceed 100 degrees centigrade or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is the South Tower, some 15 minutes after the impact of the second plane. Here too, the indicated temperatures do not exceed 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But the major problem with the sagging trusses theory is that it doesn't make any sense from a mechanical point of view. Even assuming the temperatures were high enough to make them sag to such an extent, where did these relatively thin trusses find the strength to pull and then break apart a supporting structure much larger and stronger than they were? The phenomenon suggested by NIST is called thermal expansion. If one assumes that the trusses were forced to expand downwards by the vertical structures resisting the push, it means they were weaker than the structure, and they would have never found the strength to pull it inwards. If instead the trusses sagged on their own, so weakened by fire to become unable to support their own weight, where would they find the strength to pull and break apart the same structure that had easily supported them when they were strong and healthy? In either case, the idea that the trusses alone would have been able to pull and break apart the external structure makes no sense. As we shall see, the external structure did bow inwards before the towers collapsed, but a much greater force than their own must have been applied to those trusses for them to be able to pull and break apart the structure they were attached to. Question: can you provide any evidence that the fireproofing from the steel trusses was widely dislodged by the impact of the planes, which NIST has made a necessary condition for the collapses to be caused by fire? Can you provide any evidence that the temperatures in the Twin Towers were high enough and lasted long enough to seriously weaken the steel in the areas where the initial collapses occurred? Can you explain how a sagging truss, weakened by heat, could pull and eventually break apart the structure it is attached to, with no external force being applied to it? If the explanation by NIST on what caused the initial collapse seems seriously flawed, their explanation on what caused the complete destruction of the towers does not exist. Within more than 10,000 pages filled with technical data of relative importance, in a footnote on page 82 of the NIST report we read, the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower, For brevity of this report, the sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. With the simple word inevitable, NIST purports to have explained the total destruction of 80,000 tons of a perfectly healthy steel structure upon itself.
The area below the damage zone where the planes flew in and where the fire was, that area below that, those 80 or 90 stories, 80,000 tons of structural steel was not damaged in any way. Yet you stood there and watched it destroy itself, wiping out floor by floor all 287 structural columns as if they didn't exist underneath the damage zone.
When a well-known debunking website wrote to NIST asking for a clarification on the sequence of the collapses, it received a similar answer. NIST did not describe the specific sequence of events after global collapse initiated. This astonishing statement has been repeated by NIST over and over again under the most surprising of justifications.
Once the collapse initiated, the video evidence is rather clear. It was not stopped by the floors below, so there was no calculation that we did to demonstrate that, what is clear from the videos.
This is tantamount to saying, once the Pearl Harbor attack initiated, the video evidence shows that the US fleet was quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese, so we didn't feel the need to find out why it happened. To make up for this embarrassing void, the debunkers often point at some independent studies which purport to explain the collapses by gravity alone.
Ci sono opere tecniche come quelle che vedete citate qui che analizzano in estremo dettaglio la dinamica del crollo delle torri gemelle e non trovano niente di strano.
The study most quoted by debunkers is called What Did and Did Not Cause the Collapse of the WTC Twin Towers in New York by Czech engineer Zdeněk Bezant. But in his own study, Mr. Bezant admits to have worked on a one-dimensional model, while he states, the high tilt seen on the South Tower top would call for a three-dimensional model of progressive collapse. In any case, it is not up to private studies to explain the collapse of the Twin Towers. NIST received $20 million of taxpayers' money to determine why and how World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2 collapsed following the initial impacts of the aircraft, and to this day they have not done so. This is why Architects and Engineers has kept pressing NIST, asking them to publish their data in regards to the potential energy released during the downwards movement of the upper stories and the absorptive capacity of the intact structure below the collapsed zone.
Structural engineers do this every day. This is not rocket science. You have the known weight of this building mass. You have what are known columns below it in order to resist it. You let it go in your models and you calculate what the resistance is. Why didn't they do it? Could it be because they knew darn well that it would not have collapsed at all?
In fact, it could be suggested that NIST never explained the collapses by gravity alone because it would be impossible to do so without violating at least two of the most fundamental laws of physics. One is Newton's third law of motion, which states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. This means that two opposing forces will neutralize each other. In a head-on collision, the two cars absorb each other's kinetic energy and transform it into physical deformation or damage. After that, the system comes to a rest, as there is no more energy to be dissipated.
The top section, pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. Both sections are going to be demolished at the same rate. So by the time you've crushed up 15 stories below it, the top 15 stories are also going to be crushed. And so there's nothing left now to crush the rest of the building.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with two towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But even if we assume that the top section of the tower had enough potential energy to destroy the rest of the structure below, it could not have done so at the speed it did, which was near freefall speed. That would have violated an even more important principle in physics, known as the law of momentum conservation. This law states that the total energy within an isolated system must always remain the same. As we have seen, the energy can be transformed within the system, from motion to physical deformation. But for the deformation to begin, the velocity must decrease in order for one kind of energy to be transformed into the other. No new energy can be added to the system. One particular example of momentum conservation is freefall. Freefall happens when the only force applied on an object is gravity. This means that all the potential energy contained by the object is converted into vertical motion. As soon as the falling object hits an obstacle and breakage occurs, the speed must decrease because some of its energy needs now to be converted into physical breakage. It takes energy to break things apart, and that energy must come from within the system. Thus, the falling rock cannot keep falling at free fall speed and break apart at the same time because it doesn't have enough energy to do both. Let's go now to the Twin Towers and ask a simple question. Assuming that the top section on the left contains enough potential energy to destroy the rest of the tower, and assuming we dropped both upper sections at the same time, which one would hit the ground first? It would be the second, of course. As it finds no obstacles in its path, the section on the right would quickly accelerate to free fall speed and maintain it all the way to the ground. The section on the left, instead, needs to use some of its energy to destroy the structure below, so it could never achieve free fall speed. In the case of the Twin Towers, however, both upper sections fell with an acceleration close to free fall speed, as if their path had been practically free from obstacles. It took each tower between 10 and 12 seconds to collapse to the ground, while an absolute freefall time would have been 9.2 seconds. In other words, both upper sections of the towers found enough energy to destroy 80,000 tons of healthy structure below, while accelerating to near freefall speed. This is, as we have said, absolutely impossible by gravity alone. The law of momentum conservation won't allow it.
A building cannot do free fall with a huge steel structural system in place to support it.
The Twin Towers could not have come straight down through the resistance of 80,000 tons of structural steel at the speed of practically free fall. That just would not happen.
If in fact it actually hit and made an impact, it was effectively crushing anything, pushing hard on this core structure below it, the core structure is going to push back equally hard. And that's what's going to cause the top section of the building to slow down.
As energy is drained away from the system to deform those members, it would slow down the descending mass and cause a descent at less than free fall speed.
There is only one way for those buildings to have collapsed at the speed they did.
The buildings fall at a speed which can only occur if the structure has been removed, the vertical structure.
The same Shyam Sunder from NIST has acknowledged that free fall can only be achieved with the absence of a structure below.
Free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it.
But what could have removed the supporting structure below, since the falling section didn't have any extra energy to do so?
The fact that it's coming down at free fall says all of the energy is being used to just make it go straight down, which means it's coming down through itself and not breaking up the building as it goes. Something else has to be clearing the way.
There is only one known way to allow that kind of acceleration while removing the supporting structure.
A building cannot do free fall without it being blown up. That's the only way it could come down at free fall.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
Since a near freefall speed automatically means a controlled demolition, the debunkers have tried to deny that the Twin Towers fell in about 10 seconds each.
Tempi di crollo, si parla di 10 secondi, tempo di caduta libera, esatto, ma i tempi di crollo delle torri gemelle non sono quelli di una caduta libera. Sono, sulla base dei video disponibili, di almeno 16 secondi. Basta
Basta ascoltare la durata del boato. Quindi, se avete contato con me, sono un po' più di 10 secondi.
We couldn't count with him, as it's very difficult to establish the exact duration of a collapse by listening to the sounds only. Furthermore, a couple of seconds more or less would not make a big difference, as the time for the transfer of momentum between each collapsing floor must be considered anyway.
So a floor impacting on a floor below would transfer momentum, and that floor, those floors would transfer momentum such that in the Twin Towers, if you didn't have any columns whatsoever, it would still take a minimum of 30 seconds for these towers to collapse just by transferring the momentum of the floors.
In any case, the near free-fall speed of about 10 seconds has been confirmed by different official sources. The 9/11 Commission wrote that the South Tower collapsed in 10 seconds. Mr. Sunder from NIST has confirmed similar timings.
The measurements have indicated that Tower 1 collapsed in about 11 seconds and Tower 2 collapsed in about 9 seconds.
Mr. Sunder has also acknowledged that the towers came down practically at free fall speed.
As a result, the entire top of the building came down pretty much in free fall.
The same admission is present in the official report. Since the stories below the level of collapse initiation provided little resistance, the building section above came down essentially in free fall. At this point, we can pose the following question. Given that the building section above came down essentially in free fall, given that for free fall to occur, no supporting structure must be present, and given that the falling sections didn't have any extra energy to destroy the structure below, can you suggest anything different from some kind of controlled demolition for the removal of the supporting structure, which was necessary for near free fall speed to be achieved? At this point, one may wonder what the response by the debunkers has been to all the scientific arguments presented by architects and engineers. There has been no response. All the debunkers have done is to either belittle this association of professionals or to ignore it altogether.
Et pour les ingénieurs, quand vous regardez les ingénieurs qui ont signé, alors là, c'est hallucinant. C'est-à-dire que vous avez des ingénieurs en électricité, en hydraulique, en sûreté nucléaire. Enfin bon, c'est vraiment la tour de Babel de l'ingénierie. Les personnes qui sont compétentes en calcul de structure, alors je les ai regardées, une petite trentaine, je suis gêné. Hein.
Whether the experts in structural engineering are 30 or 300, it should not make any difference. It's their arguments that must be refuted, and Courant has never done so. Attivissimo instead has chosen to belittle architects and engineers as a whole by terming all its members as gymnasium builders.
Abbiamo soltanto Richard Gage e I suoi 1200 costruttori di palestre che dicono ma secondo noi.
But Attivissimo has never responded to their arguments either. But the most shocking statement comes from Popular Mechanics. In their book, Debunking 9/11 Myths, they wrote, "Not one of the leading conspiracy theorists has a background in engineering, construction, or related fields." This statement appears both in the original publication, dated 2006, and in the revised edition, published in 2011. By then, architects and engineers had been active for almost 5 years, listed more than 1,300 experts in civil engineering, had made presentations in 20 different countries in the world, and had been invited on national television several times.
And what caught my eye is their claim that more than 1,300 architects and engineers examined the evidence about Building 7's collapse and disagree with the official report issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I certainly am much more open-minded about it than I was, and it is because of the involvement of the 9/11 families and all these engineers and architects. Clearly, they know more than I do.
The truth is that from the moment architects and engineers has entered the fray, not one of their scientific arguments disproving the official version and confirming the theory of controlled demolitions has been refuted in any way by the debunkers or by anyone else.